know, what happened to the innocence of words? Words like security, prosperity, and partnerships. They're words that should have a positive connotation, and on the contrary, they've taken on a significance, a connotation that's worrisome to, I think, many of us. SPP was launched in March 2005 by the former Martin Liberal government, and it's a trilateral agreement or trilateral deal between the United States, Canada, and Mexico. And the idea is to fast-track the harmonization of Canadian social, economic, environmental, and security policies. And it's being done, of course, by the back door through regulations. And now the issue with this government is being pushed a lot more aggressively. It's been a deal that's been called NAFTA on steroids. And we've seen the huge flaws of NAFTA. Just recently, well, let me go back. I was going to talk about an issue that I've been closely involved with in childcare, but Peter has been fighting what he calls the softwood sellout. It was truly a softwood sellout, and it was such a bad deal that I think Canadians were beginning to question this agreement with the states that was forcing us to almost to sell our raw logs with no value added. And I think that it became clear to some of us that the Conservatives saw that Canadians were starting to see that and be concerned about this trade agreement. And so the deal, a very bad deal, was signed very quickly to take it out of the media. And just recently, in the past couple of weeks, I've been made aware of letters that have been sent to community childcare centers throughout BC by a foreign-owned company, a large corporate foreign-owned company that wants to buy out these childcare centers. And they're linked, the name of the company is 123 Busy Beavers. How cute is that, right? And they're they're an affiliate of one of the largest Australian corporate big box childcare in Australia. Now, what is one of the big problems that we're facing, that we're going to face, is that as we are trying to establish a not-for-profit, community-based, quality childcare system across Canada, as this company buys up local childcare centers, then our dream of establishing a childcare system across Canada, or proper quality childcare and early learning opportunities across Canada, will be lost. Because, as you know, under NAFTA, we cannot, all these companies, including the big foreign-owned companies, will have to receive the same kind of subsidies that the non-for-profit would get. So, in fact, it really makes childcare in Canada, it would prevent us from implementing a real childcare program. And so that is because of what is called the investor state provision under NAFTA, which allows companies to sue the Canadian government for acting in the best interests of Canadians. And that's one of the things that's wrong with these trade deals. But we'll come to that later on. So this is, as I was saying, NAFTA on steroids.
So the SPP, Security and Prosperity Partnership, deep integration. NAFTA Plus, as Denise mentioned, NAFTA on steroids. It's all series of names that identify the Security and Prosperity Partnership, which is what many would say in the corporate community a logical extension of NAFTA and the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement. We've gone through the first stage in 1988, the federal election campaign, the second stage under NAFTA, and in the corporate community they think it's logical that we move on to this penultimate stage of the SPP. So it's useful, I think, to look at how we've done so far under these previous trade agreements to then judge whether or not this is in Canada's interest. So let's look at the three myths of NAFTA. The first myth, and we all saw this a few weeks ago when we hit the 20th anniversary of the negotiations around the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement, the orgy of self-congratulations from the corporate community. And the first myth, the myth that was put out most often, is that the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement and NAFTA have brought unprecedented prosperity to Canada. You always saw those two words together, unprecedented and prosperity. Myth number one. Myth number two, that we are in a full employment economy. And this is a result of the policies that have come with the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement and NAFTA. And myth number three, our exports are at record levels. Let's look at these three myths to see whether we have done as well as the corporate community would tell us that we've done since 1989. When I started as a member of Parliament in 2004, I was assigned to the International Trade Committee and went there as wet behind the ears rookie and saw the corporate CEOs coming forward to the Trade Committee with a similar message each time. They would say, well, under the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement and NAFTA, blah, 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 unprecedented prosperity for Canada, blah, 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 blah. It was the ongoing message. So I asked what I thought was a very simple question. You say unprecedented prosperity. What do you mean by that? Well, they say average incomes have gone up 6% in Canada since we signed that first Canada-US Free Trade Agreement. So I asked another simple question that I think any of you would ask in a similar situation. I said, is it the same for all income levels? And the corporate CEOs would look down at their presentations and they'd say, well, we don't know, ask Statistics Canada. So I went to Statistics Canada and I asked them, where are the income figures since 1989 for each of the income levels, for poor, middle class, wealthy Canadians? And what they said shocked me. They said, oh yeah, we gather that data, but we don't compile it and we don't publish it. So for the last 20 years, essentially Canadians have been flying blind. Corporate community telling us constantly that we have unprecedented prosperity in Canada, but we've never had the figures to prove it. So we started a one-year fight with Statistics Canada to get them to release the raw data to us, and then we ran that raw data through the Library of Parliament, compiled it, and published it for the first time last year, the second time just a few weeks ago, and we updated the annual figures. This is what has actually happened in Canada since 1989. Wealthiest of Canadians, the wealthiest 20%, have seen their income skyrocket, nearly 20%. If you're a corporate CEO or a corporate lawyer, you're doing better than ever. What's happened to the middle class? Well, quite the contrary. For the middle class, in real terms, middle-class families have lost the equivalent of 1 week's wages. That's each and every year since the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement was implemented in 1989. What that means is Canadian families who are working 52 weeks a year are getting paid now 51 weeks for their labor. That's the middle class. Let's look at the lower middle class. Well, for them, the prosperity gap has been twice as bad. They're earning less in real terms, and they've lost 2 weeks' wages on average for each of those years since 1989. They're working 52-week years and getting paid about 50 weeks of wages, compared to 1989 when they worked a 52-week year and got 52 weeks of wages. And how about the poorest of Canadians? Well, it wouldn't shock any of you to know that for the poorest of Canadians, it has been an economic catastrophe. The average poor Canadian family, the 6 million Canadians, has lost a month and a half of wages over this same period, each and every year. What that means is They're working 12-month years, and they're getting paid the equivalent of 10.5 months of wages, compared to 1989, when they worked a 12-month year and got 12 months' wages for it. But there's no secret why we have hundreds of thousands of Canadians sleeping out on the main streets and parks of our country tonight. 300,000 Canadians, it's estimated, will be sleeping out in the cold this evening. No secret why that income crisis is happening. If the poor have lost a month and a half's wages, they simply cannot afford to keep a roof over their head. What has happened fundamentally is an economic shift. And what that has meant is that for middle class, lower middle class, the poorest of Canadian families, 2/3 of Canadian families are worse off. They have lost in real terms, while the wealthiest of Canadians now are sucking an ever-increasing part of the income pie. The richest Canadians now take half of all income in our country. It's not just the issue of incomes. It's also the fact that overtime hours are up by now over a quarter, that the average number of Canadians working overtime has gone up 50%. So at the same time as Canadians are earning less and less, since 1989, the litmus test, the Canada signing and implementation of the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement, at the same time, they're working longer and longer weeks. And the result has been, our figures show as well, that for the average Canadian family, their debt load has almost doubled over this same time period. So what has been the result? What is the unprecedented prosperity that you're going to see on every nightly newscast, and certainly from every corporate CEO? What it has actually meant is for most Canadian families, less income, harder and longer weeks, and a higher and higher debt load. That's myth number one. Myth number two, full employment economy. My goodness, we're doing well. But StatsCan actually publishes those figures, and what they've told us is the following, that most jobs created today are temporary and part-time in nature. They are not family sustaining, and that is why we can explain the drop in real income for most Canadian families. Most jobs created today do not come with benefits. Most jobs created in today's economy do not come with pensions. This means not only do we have a current income crisis, but we have an apprehended income crisis. Let's think about this for a moment. A student at the University of Victoria who is graduating with a higher debt load, we know, than from many years ago, a debt load that in many cases is almost insurmountable. They go out in a job market that StatsCan tells us now has a much lower entering wage for that same individual, which will mean a much longer period of time for them to actually pay off their debts. And at the end of that working life, in most cases now, with jobs created in today's economy, there's no pension waiting at the end of the road. What we're talking about now, in a very real sense, is a life of indebtment that continues right through to a period when there is no longer any company pension available to that individual. What type of economy are we in the process of creating when we put that individual through a debt load that is unsustainable and constant throughout their life, and at the end of their working life, they cannot even hope to have a company pension? So myth number two, full employment economy, simply belies the reality that the jobs created today are of much poorer quality than the jobs, the family-sustaining jobs that we had in our economy 20 years ago. And the third myth, the myth that our exports are now at record levels. Well, Murray Dobbin's been one of, I think, the most effective spokespeople in ripping apart this myth. But the reality is, a lot of this is intercompany transfers and our oil and gas resources that arguably could go anywhere in the world. So those are the three myths of the unprecedented prosperity that you'll read about anytime there's reference to the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement and NAFTA. And I should mention, in Foreign Affairs this summer, very prestigious American magazine, there was an article by Kenneth Sheave and Matthew Slaughter, two individuals who are university professors and also carry the oxymoronic titles of economic advisors to President Bush. They were concerned about the loss of support for globalization because in the United States, we have seen the same type of economic disparity. In fact, from 2001 to 2005, they estimate that for 96% of American families, their real income went down, and they now estimate that income inequality in the United States is now at the same level as it was in 1928. Think about that for a moment. This is previous to the New Deal. We're now working with the CCPA to try to determine in Canada how far back the clock has been turned. Are we back to 1940? Are we back to 1935? Are we back to 1930? These are very important economic questions that have to be asked. And they're being asked by activists. They're certainly not being asked by the corporate community. So, what is the SPP? The logical outcome, they would say, of what has come from the unprecedented prosperity of NAFTA and the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement. It was started as a liberal agenda. In 2005, Paul Martin put it forward, and the basic structure of the SPP has not really changed since then. In fact, Jessica Johnson in this magazine, an excellent article that she wrote this summer, commented on what has been a seamless transition from the Liberals to the Conservatives on the formation of the SPP. We're talking about 20 working groups that operate behind the scenes, and they essentially make the decisions about moving forward this agenda. So, it is essentially a liberal agenda put in place that the Conservatives have continued, and Stéphane Dion, despite his pretensions to the contrary, has been directly involved in the evolution of the SPP. It is a liberal conservative agenda. So, the NDP wants to stop it. And I'm going to give you now 10 reasons why we want to stop the SPP. Number one, it is fundamentally anti-democratic by nature. That is how it has been set up. We held hearings in the spring. I'll come back to those in a moment. And one of the first witnesses to come before the International Trade Committee was the Canadian Council of Chief Executives. What they said there was that they had set up the SPP. They preferred this approach on the SPP because, quote, the public was not ready for this agenda, unquote. That's why they want to keep it out of the parliamentary domain. That's why they want to keep it out of the public domain. That's certainly why they want to keep it away from activists and committed Canadians such as yourselves. It is, by design, fundamentally anti-democratic. What they are attempting to do is revise and deepen and broaden that deep integration, but they know the public's not ready, and so they want to stay away from any sort of democratic approach to this discussion. And our job as activists, and our job in the NDP, is to make sure we get it out in the public so the public has their say, and we know Canadians will reject this agenda when it's out in the public. Number two, it is profound secrecy. It is operating under profound secrecy for the very reason I just mentioned, for reason number one. We have been attempting now for the past year, through a series of access to information requests, a series of order paper questions, the parliamentary hearings, to get the issue out in the public. And we've been fighting with the Conservatives as we fought with the Liberals. Now, I recently got a whole series of access to information requests back, and for your benefit, I'll show it to you. I'll just show you 3 pages. Here's one exhibit. Half of that's blanked out. Here's another page. They didn't get much information out of that. Here's the 3rd page. We know who that email was from. But this has been part of the systematic approach to keep this whole agenda secret. Our access to information requests in every case, as under the Liberals, with the Conservatives, they have been drawn out as long as possible. We now have complaints to the Information Commissioner on the length of reply that it has taken on these various requests for the minutes and the information of what is being negotiated at the working group level. We have also, with order paper questions, put this information front and center. But we are now reaching the point, happily, where the Conservatives are going to have to, if they do not, they will get in trouble with the Information Commissioner. They will have to start putting the information forward. And we will make sure that we're getting that information out into the public domain. But point number 2, our top 10 list of why we want to stop the SPP is that it is all done in profound secrecy by design. Reason number 3, it is much more than just about jelly beans. And I'll quote from you some of the information that we've gotten back so far. This is from the government's own internal memos that we've gotten through access to information. It is a profound and wide-ranging agenda. Obviously, Stephen Harper didn't read that memo. It has sweeping impact. These are from the minutes of the working groups themselves. This is much more than simply about jelly beans. In fact, we're looking at over 300 regulatory areas that are going to be changed. It is widespread, it is profound, it is sweeping in nature, and I'm quoting the words of the individuals involved in these secret negotiations themselves. Number 4, it's not just the widespread nature of these regulatory changes, it is also the quality of what is being proposed. We're talking about quality of life issues. We're talking about things like air safety. We're talking about things like food safety and drug safety. All of these are part of the regulatory changes that are being proposed. I'll give you one example. The NDP fought back just a few months ago. Efforts to lower the number of flight attendants on Canadian flights. Why? Well, because we had to be in harmony with American regulations that are lower. There's a problem with that. Problem is, we have an increasing number of seniors and people with disabilities who are traveling on Canadian flights. You lower the number of flight attendants, you put those individuals in danger when the plane needs to be evacuated, as the recent disaster, or near disaster in Toronto by Air France proved. You need to have those flight attendants on the planes to evacuate the passengers. I'm happy to say in this case the NDP was able to push back this issue. But we're having 300 different areas coming at us. So we have to make sure we're identifying and fighting back in each of these issues. Secondly, food safety. You may have seen over the last few months, the Harper government announced that they wanted to remove a trade impediment, and that would be by increasing the pesticide residue permissible in food imported into Canada. This is a bad reason for from two standpoints. The first, from the consumer point of view, we know that increasing pesticide residue is linked to such diseases as Parkinson's disease. Secondly, from the producer standpoint, we now have producers who have been working at a higher level, and our government is now moving to allow a lower level of competitivity, simply bringing in goods from abroad, from the United States, with a higher level of pesticide residue. So, both from the consumer standpoint and the producer standpoint, this is bad news for Canada. Drug safety. We have seen with bovine growth hormone, the Council of Canadians fought back on, and a variety of other issues, that in the United States, the whole issue of drug approval is controversial, to say the least, and drugs that are put on the market are often withdrawn. By harmonization, we would be having Canadian standards at a lower American standard, and that is something else that would put Canadian health in jeopardy. But it is not just where we have existing standards that standards would be lowered. And on issues like air safety and food safety and drug safety, we would be putting Canadians' health at risk. It's also our ability as a nation to move forward to higher standards. Parliament 2 years ago adopted a motion, an NDP motion, to ban trans fats in Canada. And this is currently stalled, in part because moving to ban trans fats would put Canada at a higher standard than at the United States. So essentially, it is not just that we lower our existing standards, it cuts us off from moving to higher standards in the future. And in the case of trans fat, it's estimated that 3,000 to 5,000 Canadians a year die from trans fats being in our diet. 5, issues around civil rights and the erosion of civil rights in Canada. What we have seen in the United States is an increasingly ugly situation around human rights. And I'll quote from you the recent reuse of the U.S. Military Commissions Act that has been used to support the imprisonments that we've seen in Guantanamo Bay. What the American Civil Liberties Union said about that is that the U.S. Military Commissions Act allows detainees to be sentenced to death based on testimony obtained through beatings and gives a get-out-of-jail-free card to the Bush administration for war crimes. We are seeing this move towards an erosion of our civil rights in Canada in a variety of areas, not just from what's adopted in the United States, but simply having Canada acquiesce to that erosion of those standards in Canada. Two case examples. Recently, Bell Helicopter. Bell Helicopter in Montreal put aside technicians who had passed security clearances because the United States, the military contractor, refused to allow those individuals, because they came from one of the 25 countries of origin where those individuals are prohibited from working on U.S. military contracts. Bell Helicopter was forced to put those technicians in another room, keep them away from doing the work that they had been hired to do in Canada after passing security screenings in Canada. In a very real sense, that amounted to constructive dismissal for each and every one of those employees. Ann Wright, an activist in the United States who was a longtime member of the U.S. military, the first de facto U.S. ambassador to Kabul after the invasion of Afghanistan, and who subsequently resigned her commission and became a peaceful, nonviolent protester against Bush administration policy, was recently refused entry into Canada to speak as a peaceful dissident against U.S. military policy and against the Bush administration. Then we see in civil rights the imposition of the no-fly list in Canada. Now, it didn't work in the United States. We know what kind of names were found on the U.S. no-fly list. Senator Ted Kennedy, Pat Martin, an NDP MP. A number of other innocent individuals thrown off flights because their name was found on the no-fly list, and now in Canada we have adopted the same type of process. 6, military, foreign, immigration policy. Integration of those policies mean Canada's ability to represent our nation abroad becomes seriously diminished. Canadians were recently asked whether we believe that our foreign policy should be independent, that we should have an independent voice in the world, and 83% of Canadians said yes. What we have from the Harper government is a direction on foreign policy that is exactly the opposite, where any moves on international foreign policy have to balance, that was the word that was used in the document, balance off where the United States is going on those same foreign policy questions before we can, as a country, make that decision. On military policy, it's very similar. In fact, as Michael Byers has said, Canada's ability to function as an independent military, particularly when it comes to peacekeeping missions, has been seriously diminished because, in a very real sense, we are integrating our military with that of the United States military. Immigration policy. Same thing, particularly with temporary workers. There is a drive within the SPP to increase the number of temporary workers brought in, particularly to Canada and the United States. Temporary workers, as we know, simply a way of getting around labor standards and wage standards that are set in Canadian jurisdictions by Canadian governments. 7, water. Now, Canada has vast water resources. 20% of the world's fresh water. However, the renewable freshwater supplies that we have are only about 6%. It's similar to the United States. In a very real sense, what we have is a large bank account, but very low interest rate. 20% of the world's fresh water, 6% of the renewable freshwater supply. And part and parcel of the SPP, in fact, the sections that are the most blanked out are any sections dealing with bulk water exports or water transfers. Now, we know under NAFTA that water is not treated as a commodity until the first water exports start happening. If any province decides to start exporting water, then essentially what that does is turn on the spigot or the faucet. It's very difficult to turn it off afterwards. Why? Because the investor state provisions, the Chapter 11 provisions that Denise referred to earlier, kick in, which means if a government refuses that ability to export water, then that company can sue the taxpayers to ensure that they're compensated for that loss of profits. The Ethel Corporation case is, I think, a very important one in this regard. where a neurotoxin was banned by the Canadian government, and Canadian taxpayers, everybody in this room, had to cough up money, $13 million, to compensate the company for the loss of profits on a product that they knew was a neurotoxin, that they knew was toxic. Bulk water exports, it is the same perverse reasoning. Once we start the exports, difficult to stop. And under the SPP, water is very clearly on the table. 8, energy sovereignty. This is 8 on the top 10 list of why we need to stop the SPP. Now, Gordon Laxer was the last person who appeared before the International Trade Committee hearings last spring on the SPP. Now, how we got those hearings is, I think, a very interesting point. I tried for a year to get the International Trade Committee to have the SPP hearings. I said it was an important public policy piece. Canadians need to know the truth. And Liberals and Conservatives said, yeah. Then they decided they wanted to go on a trip. They wanted to go to Singapore. Members of the Trade Committee, Liberals and Conservatives. Now, the important thing to know about trips is you need all-party agreement in order to go on a trip. So I said, well, I can't agree to having you guys go to Singapore, it's all guys, unless you agree to have hearings on the SPP so that public can hear the truth. And we got the hearings 2-3 weeks later. They were shut down when Gordon Laxer testified. Why? Because Gordon Laxer, an Albertan, one of the best energy experts in the country, Parkland Institute from Edmonton, came forward, and what he said embarrassed the Conservatives and the Liberals. He talked about the fact that under proportionality, Canada is now sharing 60% of its oil, 60% of its gas with the United States, and because of proportionality, if there is a supply shortage, we have to continue to supply the American market, even if Canadians, particularly in Eastern Canada, are literally freezing in the dark. Now, 40% of our oil supplies come from offshore, particularly the Middle East. That is a very likely possibility. He also talked about the fact that we have now no strategic reserve in our energy resources. In fact, Canada is virtually the only country in the world that provides preferential access to another country. And Mexico said no to the same deal. When Gordon Laxer started saying that, the Conservatives went ballistic. The chair of the International Trade Committee, Leon Benoit, left the scene, and Liberals and Conservatives agreed that they would not continue the hearings. We're going to be coming back. In just 2 weeks, the International Trade Committee will be meeting for the first time since the spring, and we're going to be pushing for new hearings on the SPP so that Canadians can hear the truth. 9, economic decisions. The softwood sellout is very illustrative of where we are going on our economic decision-making capacity under the SPP. Under the softwood sellout now, forestry policy is made in Washington. It's not made in Victoria or in Regina or in Winnipeg. And we now have a hit list of Canadian provinces. Anytime any Canadian province has endeavored to move to help out their softwood communities, the Bush administration and the U.S. lumber lobby has said, no, you can't do that under this softwood agreement. What the softwood sellout does is something that is writ large in the SPP. Virtually every sector of our economy, those decisions will not be made in Ottawa or in local communities or in provinces. Those decisions will be made in Washington. Which brings me to reason number 10, why the NDP is fighting to stop the SPP. If we take away our ability to control our natural resources, if we take away our ability to decide what is best for the environment and ecology and our energy supplies, if we take away our ability to establish regulations and protections in air safety and food safety and drug safety, if we take our ability away to make those democratic decisions as Canadians, what is left in the end? And that logic that has brought us through the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement and NAFTA, now to the SPP, inevitably leads to the final step, which is total integration. What is left as for Canadians to decide? The 10th reason why the NDP is rejecting the SPP is because fundamentally, as Canadians, We have always managed to make decisions together, cooperatively, with public sector and the private sector and the cooperative sector. Canadians of a wide range of diversity have worked together to build a nation that up until a few years ago was considered the best place to live in the world. And we can reestablish that again, but we have to have those levers of decision-making ability. The NDP is fighting to stop the SPP. We'll come back later to the kinds of solutions and the kind of work that we're asking you to do. But I urge you to join the NDP in fighting to stop the SPP. Thank you.
As many of you know, Canada has gone through enormous changes in the past 20 years. Ever since Brian Mulroney in 1987 said, "Give me 20 years and you won't recognize this country." Fortunately, we only gave him 10, but then we got Paul Martin as finance minister, and he essentially finished the job. And now, which is almost unbelievable, I wake up every morning saying, how on earth can this wonderful country have Stephen Harper, a man who hates this country, as prime minister? But we still recognize Canada. And one of the reasons we still recognize it is because of people like you in this room who fought to defend Medicare and fought for public education and all the other things that we created as a nation after the Second World War. So if you think that we've lost a lot of battles, you're probably right. But if we hadn't been fighting, things would be enormously worse. Nonetheless, Canadian citizens have an enormous challenge in front of them. Our ruling elite, both economic and political, have completely betrayed us. For decades, those elites accepted grudgingly the narrative, the story of our nation, that is to say, sharing for survival. That's what Canada meant. It contrasted sharply with the story, the narrative in the US, which was survival of the fittest, a kind of radical individualism. But beginning in the late 70s and early 80s, and certainly coming to fruition with the free trade agreement, that the attitude of our elites changed radically to an adoption of American values, individualism and competitiveness and unfettered capitalism. It started with the free trade agreement and continued through Paul Martin's enormous tax cuts. The only person who's given bigger tax cuts to corporations than Stephen Harper just gave was Paul Martin, who gave $100 billion tax cuts to the rich and to corporations in the year 2000. So for almost 15 years, the values of the elites of this country have been at complete odds with the values of the vast majority. And there's a company called Ecos Polling. You can visit their website. They do a poll each year comparing the attitudes of the elites with the attitudes of the rest of us, and they are radically different. But I will say there's room for optimism because the attitudes of ordinary Canadians are extremely progressive. It's just that their expectations have been dramatically lowered. So the fact is that those who exercise power in this country, economic power and political power, are no longer committed to the country, no longer committed to nation building. Their neoliberal ideology wipes away all concern for tradition, for culture, for history, for equality, and for community. It is best summed up by one of Canada's most insightful social commentators, Ursula Franklin. I love this quote. I use it a lot. And she wrote, "We are being occupied by the marketeers, just as the French and Norwegians were occupied by the Germans. We have, as they did, puppet governments who run the country for the benefit of the occupiers. We have, as they did, collaborators. We, like the French and Norwegians of the time, have to protect our families and on many occasions have to work with the occupiers. We are, as they, threatened by deliberate willfulness by people who have only contempt for those who they occupy, and those whose mission is to turn over our territory to their masters." So deep integration really is the final stage of the Canadian corporate vision of Canada and its plan for the country. The absorption of Canada and the Canadian nation into the United States is really, and also integrating us into the United States global posture as an empire, is sort of the final final stage. It started with free trade, but free trade and NAFTA actually failed. Not only did free trade and NAFTA fail us, and Peter's talked about that, it also actually failed in terms of what big business thought it would do. There's a really interesting quote, I didn't bring it tonight, by Peter Nicholson, who was a bank executive and when Paul Martin was Prime Minister, was one of his chief advisors. And he actually admitted, he said, well, when we signed the free trade deal, it was a leap of faith. We thought that Canadian corporations would rise to the occasion and compete with the United States. But he says what we found was that they just chickened out and went over the border and sold out. So even this guru of free trade acknowledged that Canadian companies couldn't cut it. And that is essentially why we have deep integration. 95% of foreign investment in this country goes to buying up Canadian companies since the free trade agreement was signed. 95%. Head offices moved to the United States. Canadian corporations are falling behind the United States every year in terms of productivity. Studies by Harvard University economists, not exactly a bunch of radicals, have pointed out that the reason that Canadian corporations can't cut it is that they're risk averse, they have their nose in the government trough too much, and that they take the easy way out rather than increasing spending on technology, on training their workers, and improving the way they manage their companies. They simply sell to the closest buyer, and that's been the United States, which is why we sell over 80% of our exports to the US. In short, the leap of faith that Mulrooney made in 1988 was a leap off a cliff. Their assumption that Canadian business would be inspired to compete was wrong, and Bay Street has now acknowledged that since the late 1990s. But with 9/11, the whole assumption of free trade suddenly faced a major problem. They closed the border for a few days, and it scared the hell out of Bay Street. So Bay Street very quickly set up a meeting with some of the major CEOs in the United States and some of the administration officials and some of the advisors to the Bush administration. And they got a message very quickly, and that was security trumps trade. If you want to keep trading into the United States, they said, you better get on board with all security stuff, and security extremely broadly defined, to include energy, to include water, to include access to Canadian markets and Canadian resources. Everything flowed from the message that Tom d'Aquino and the BCNI, although it's now called the Canadian Council of Chief Executives, they changed their name. And you know why? It used to be called the Business Council on National Issues. They changed their name because they don't believe there are any national issues. No, I'm serious. This is exactly why they changed their names. They changed their name because they have, when they changed their name from the Business Council on National Issues to the Canadian Council of Chief Executives, that was the day they had decided on deep integration. Now, the BCNI, it's important to give a bit of background to these guys. It's 150 largest corporations in Canada, worth something now, I think, around $3 trillion, which is a huge amount of money. It's almost, well, it's the gross domestic product of the country for 2 years. You add it up. From the early 1980s, they set up essentially a sort of parallel government. Business lobby groups used to go to government and say, we don't like that environmental law, and hope that they wouldn't pass it. The BCNI actually would second lawyers from their various member companies, and they would write the laws that they wanted. They would write them, and they would present them to the government. By the time Brian Mulrooney came to power, he was passing legislation that was written by Tom d'Aquino in the BCNI. That's how far we have come in terms of corporate government, the replacement of democratic government by corporate government. Now, it's interesting to look at the evolution of deep integration. I actually started writing about this exactly 5 years ago, in the fall of 2002, even though it took me a few months to figure out what they were up to. But one of the first articles written, if you want to see the mentality of the people who have put this program together, one of the first articles was written by a woman named Wendy Dobson from the C.D. Howe Institute, who just happened to have been an assistant to Paul Martin when he was finance minister. Here's what she said. in an article in the spring of 2002, just after they'd gone down to meet with all these guys in the U.S. to find out what the U.S. wanted. Quote, Canada should anticipate change and initiate a big idea that serves the major interests of its partner. This comes first, while channeling action in ways that best serve its own interests. So in other words, Canada's interest is sort of an add-on. Dobson claimed that a key component of the big idea should be the handing over of Canada's energy resources as a sort of initial sacrifice. Quote, instead of waiting to be told what's expected of us, Canadian governments and industry should prepare for this possibility in a proactive way. Oh, I need a drink. So that's the mentality of these people. If you wonder, I always get the question when I've talked about free trade agreement, well, why? And people are genuinely puzzled, as they should be. Why would a government give up its power to govern, which is what this is, of course? That's why. The people who are the elite in Canada all think just like Wendy Dobson. So if you ever wonder again, remember that quote. Proactive. And it's like, so even if the United States doesn't want to do this deal, we're still screwed because they'll just keep giving more until, there was a great cartoon during the free trade fight by a guy named Aislinn, a cartoonist with the Montreal Gazette, and it had Uncle Sam with the big hat with the flag on it, walking along, and beside him was the Beaver, who of course is Canada, and they were talking about the free trade agreement. And the Beaver says, okay, Sam, we'll give you everything, but that's our final offer. And Sam says, let me think about it. This is an empire talking, right? Let me think about it, because Canada might not know what everything actually means. So after this, in the late 2002, they had a whole series of forums of very prominent Canadians put together by all the business think tanks, funded by all the right-wing pro-business foundations. It was a lovely little combination. So that was sort of an elite consensus-building thing, right? You invite all the important people, or at least people who think they're important, and you get them on board on this notion of the disappearance of Canada. And so out of that came a series of documents called the North American Security and Prosperity Initiative. Sound familiar? It's almost identical to the name of the agreement that was signed in 2005, produced by Tom DeQuino, or Tom DeQuisling, as I like to call him, created by this 150 largest corporations in Canada. Interesting, some of the documents that came out of those first meetings, now they don't even want to talk about them. One of them said, well, we'll have to change the curriculum so that Canadian students start to think of themselves as North Americans. I'm serious. This is the kind of stuff that was coming out that wasn't meant for public consumption, but we got our hands on it. Then, of course, there was another group, the Task Force on the Future of North America. That was about 24 senior former politicians and senior executives. And to show that it was both the Liberals and the Conservatives, it had John Manley and Michael Wilson as key members. Tom DeQuino chaired. And just to be sure that the Americans knew that the oil companies ran our country as well, the only business people on it actually were two oil executives from Alberta. Then, of course, in 2005, it took a leap ahead with the signing of the SPP. But it's really important to understand that this is not like NAFTA. This is an exclusively executive agreement. This is between two presidents and a prime minister. It's never been formally debated in any legislature. Despite the efforts of the NDP in Ottawa, there's never been a debate about this, and because they'll never make the same mistake they made. They know that if they put this out in a document and say, we're going to sign this, a year from now, the country would go crazy, just like it did with free trade. And we won the battle for hearts and minds on free trade, just to remind you, even though we lost the election. So they will never do this. They will never make legislation. And part of the group that now advises the SPP, the North American Competitiveness Council, one of them is a guy by the name of Covey, and And he told Maclean's magazines, we're not going to do any of this stuff through legislation. We're going to do it all behind closed doors because, as Peter also said, this cannot survive the light of day. So then there was a meeting in 2006 in Cancun, and of course the meeting this year in Montebello of the SPP and the three leaders talking about it. So, and there was all kinds of formative meetings are still taking place, the ones that led up to the SPP being signed, but also there are constantly meetings of the American and Mexican and Canadian elites in various capacities. In Banff last year in September, very high-profile meeting that was completely secret. The only newspaper that covered it was the Banff Weekly, until afterwards when we got some documents from it. Very high-profile people. George Shultz, a former Secretary of State in the U.S. Rumsfeld was allegedly there, although it was so secret we could never actually confirm that. Rick Hillier, head of the Armed Forces, Defense Minister O'Connor, Stockwell Day, the man who walks with dinosaurs. I can't believe it. As hard as it is to believe that Harper's Prime Minister, it's incredibly hard to believe that Stockwell Day, who actually believed that humans and dinosaurs walked on the planet at the same time, is where he is. Anyway, he said, I'm not admitting I was there, and even if I was, I wouldn't tell you. So now, it was kind of funny, except that this is a minister of our government, and he feels that he can say to the Canadian people, this was a private meeting at which a minister of the Canadian government was at. It shows you, again, how far the elite has gone in assuming that they can make decisions about our future without any reference to democratic institutions or to the people of the country. Last April 27th and 28th, 2 meetings in Calgary, one about energy, one about water, co-chaired by Peter Lougheed, who should know better, really. I mean, this guy actually came out at one point and suggested we should go back to the Foreign Investment Review Agency. But then he didn't get invited to any cocktail parties, and he's changed his position since then. And of course, these meetings in Calgary were sponsored by something called the Center for Strategic and International Studies. It has 4 other meetings planned, and no doubt they'll talk about other aspects of deep integration. So where are the biggest threats from deep integration in the SPP? There's everything, of course. There's this huge package of deregulation that Peter's talked about and is doing an incredible service sort of ferreting out all the stuff that's going on there. Our integration into American defense. We now are the 6th largest spender in NATO, in real dollars, not relative, in real dollars. We are spending now more than we've ever spent militarily in terms of the percentage of GDP, more than ever since the Second World War, more than we were spending during the Korean War. And all of it, or almost all of it, is equipment that has what is called interoperability. In other words, it's identical to the kinds of equipment the United States have, so that we can join easily with them in their next, preemptive invasion of some poor, desperate country that has oil. It's a curse to have oil these days, No, we don't have any oil. No, we don't. And water. So these are the 2 things that are the biggest threat to this country, are Americans' need for energy security and their need for water security. I just got this quote. One of the activists on the SPP found this quote, and this is one of the U.S. Negotiators for the SPP, and he talked about energy. And here's a quote: "It would be," this really sends chills up my spine. "It would be a counterproductive international provocation if a future government in any of the 3 countries tried to back out of the SPP." That doesn't leave a whole lot in doubt about what the United States would do. A provocation, a counterproductive international provocation. In other words, unless you're an idiot, don't do this, or we'll do something really bad. So water is next. Some of you saw the story about a town in Tennessee. It's completely out of water. It has no water. They truck in all their water. And this is just the beginning. There's lots more we could talk about. Tilma, for example, is totally a part of the SPP. We could talk about that later. And so, in a way, is the $60 billion in tax cuts that Stephen Harper just announced recently, because it diminishes our country down to the same level as the United States in terms of public space versus private space. So, how am I doing for time?
You've got about 7 minutes.
Oh, that's perfect. Okay. So do people know about this? Well, most people don't, and you know that because you've probably talked to your colleagues and family members and others, and most people still, if they've heard of it, they vaguely know it's not real good, but they don't know the details. So every once in a while, something sneaks out. There was the pesticide story that Peter mentioned, and that got a bit of coverage, and people were shocked and appalled appropriately, but of course, with information overload, people move on, and that sort of fades away. And the whole thing with the head of the committee shutting down the hearings and saying what Gordon Laxer was saying was irrelevant. Imagine that, irrelevant, that we have no security for ourselves in terms of energy. So that was in the news for a while. But we know we have this no-fly list. I mean, people are sort of aware that we now have a no-fly list, just like the United States does. So you get all these little things, and they sort of go, oh yeah, that's bad. Oh, and then and then Britney Spears gets out of jail, and or O.J. Simpson, what an idiot, right? So this is sort of what they feed us, right, as news, these little tidbits, so we forget about everything else. Montebello put deep integration on the agenda for a few days. I think that was really important. But again, it's stuff, it slips away, right? It's not like NAFTA or free trade or the MAI. The MAI we defeated, which is an unbelievable victory. How many of you remember the MAI? Yeah? Yeah. I mean, it was such a victory, we were so stunned that we didn't celebrate it, right? I woke up, I can remember the morning, I woke up, got the Globe and Mail, and there's like a 4-inch story, France walks away from talks. That's it, folks, France walks away and it's dead. And that was our victory. That was the entire media coverage of our victory. But we stopped the largest corporations in the world and all of the industrialized nations in the world, and they all really wanted this. Just to give you an idea of how we can't accept victories, I mentioned this to an unnamed person in Vancouver, and they said, oh, well, they didn't want it anyway, right? So if we won, it wasn't a real victory because they didn't really want it. That's how geared we are to thinking that we can't win. But of course, we can win. When the only CBC program now that's actually covering it, how many of you watch Intelligence? Oh, you don't watch Intelligence? This is the best drama on television. It's on Monday nights at 9 o'clock, and the recent version of it was all about deep integration. The opening scene was the CSIS, head of CSIS for Western Canada, and she's got a document in her hand, and the front cover of it is secret, the war for Canada's water. And most of the program, there's lots of elements to it, but most of the program was about the fact that corporations were selling out Canada. They bugged the room of a bunch of corporate CEOs who were planning deep integration. Now, I'm going to divert a bit here. What's really puzzled me about this is one of the most successful and most highly rated programs that CBC has ever done. It is the best drama I've ever watched. It's the only one I unplugged the telephone for. It sells in 20 countries. So why has the CBC not promoted it once? There's not a single promo for this program. Not one. Why would that be? Would it be that they want the audience to be small so they can cancel it? Anyway, I'm not really a conspiracy theorist, except when people accuse me of that, I say, well, it just seems to make more sense than the coincidence theory. Okay. So the current state of opposition to deep integration is that civil society groups are, I think, finally gearing up. The Council of Canadians has been on this case for quite a while. The CCPA has done some excellent studies. If you want more information on this, both these groups have very good sources. The Canadian Labour Congress is now working on this as well. Steve Staples of the Rideau Institute is doing a lot of work that exposes the military aspect and foreign policy aspect of deep integration. The Parkland Institute is doing excellent stuff on energy. And it's interesting that after Montebello, everyone sort of jumped on the NDP bandwagon and said, oh yeah, there's a 14-page thing put out by Dion against deep integration, or parts of it anyway. which is a good thing, even though you can't take it really seriously, seeing as he was, as Peter says, was part of the government that brought it in. But the fact that he felt he had to was an important victory for us. And of course, even the Bloc, which has historically been in favor of free trade, came out against SPP. So what should we focus on in fighting this? I'm just going to run through a quick thing, and there's a lot of overlap with what Peter says, but just looking at it strategically, what are the things that would resonate most with Canadians? The environment and global warming, because this is a key part of this is why the oil companies and the gas companies in Alberta will not be touched by the Harper government. It's because of deep integration. The whole energy security and the tar sands, I think energy security is something that Canadians really care about. The Afghan war and our involvement in that is something that Canadians, in spite of all the incredible propaganda that even the CBC pumps out, Canadians still are very uncomfortable with our role in Afghanistan. The focus on secrecy, as Peter pointed out, and the profoundly anti-democratic nature of this agreement is extremely important. Water as well. But other things too, like the privatization of Medicare may not be explicitly written into deep integration, but that's what will happen. It is an inevitable result of deep integration and $60 billion in tax cuts. So that is on the agenda, even though it's not talked about necessarily in terms of deep integration. Now we were asked what people could do. What people can do. In the United States, the Christian right gives 10% of its pre-tax income to its cause. That's what members of the Christian right do. When we all start doing that, and I'm not suggesting that people who are living on the edge, and you know who you are, and you know who you aren't, but until we take our values and our causes that seriously, that we begin to give 10% of our pre-tax income to organizations like the CCPA, the Council of Canadians, the NDP, those groups that are fighting this agenda, then we're not serious. Secondly, the bigger picture is that the notion that we can save the planet by buying a Prius is dangerously delusional. We can't do that. We have to stop buying junk. We have to do that. The only way, one of the ways to defeat this beast is to starve it to death, is to not allow it to grow. And the way to do that is to decrease our footprint and to do it really consciously and to sacrifice. That doesn't mean not going out for dinner 6 times a week, but only going out 4 times a week. It's not going out to dinner at all. When we stop doing those kinds of things, we will all know collectively that we're serious. The third thing is just keep doing what you've always done, and that is fight like hell for social justice. Thank you.